in the term already, with the end of term fast approaching. So we do really appreciate those of you who have given up your very busy schedules to join us for the session tonight. We are going to be focusing on differentiation. You'll see that we have kept your cameras and microphones muted just to help with the bandwidth, but please feel free to add comments in the chat as we go along. A little reminder tonight that this session will be recorded so that people can watch this back, or you might want to look back on bits later on. It also allows you that time to kind of revisit or to share the messages with some of your colleagues. Hopefully you'll be quite familiar with using Teams by this point in the term, but just a reminder that you can make the slides full screen. You can turn on live captions if you're somewhere where it's difficult to hear us. As I say, please do join in with the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to come in. And if you have any problems in terms of the slides or the sound disappearing, we always suggest that kind of turning it on and back off again. So pressing the leave button and rejoining. And then if that doesn't work, drop us a little message in the chat and we'll try and help you with it. So just a little connector to get us kind of started off. If you could travel anywhere in the world, so cost is no object, where would you go? So I'll give you a little minute just to put your answers into the chat. Some very exotic places coming in, the Maldives from Heather there, and Thailand. Oh, a few people for Thailand, the Maldives, and the Seychelles. Nice. Oh, the Bahamas. Oh, somebody, that would be my choice, New York there. Oh, a few people saying Japan. Interesting. Yes, lots of people looking for hot sunshine, I think, as well. Oh, another vote for New York. Yeah, that's definitely my favourite, and you definitely need cost to be no object when you're visiting there. Oh, another sun lover, Saint-Tropez, nice. Lots of lovely places for us to be thinking about, and hopefully lots of you will be having nice summer plans beginning to fill your diary as well. So tonight, as I said, we will look at differentiation. We will talk about what we actually mean when we say that word differentiation, and I think it's important that when we're thinking about numeracy and maths, differentiated learning is about adapting your learning, your teaching and assessment to meet the needs of the individual children in your class. It's not one single thing. We often hear people saying, oh, you need to differentiate, as if it's kind of just one holistic thing. But actually differentiation isn't a singular thing. There's lots of different elements to it. And we'll talk a bit about how we can be doing that in terms of modifying the content, the process, the products, or the wider learning environment. And as we go through the session tonight, we're going to explore why we need to differentiate, and we'll share some examples with you along the way of how to differentiate when you're thinking about numeracy and maths. So I'm going to give you a moment to complete this Menti task. So you will see the code on screen, or if you've got another device, you might be able just to scan it. When you think about that word differentiation, what comes to your mind? And so you can see with Menti, the larger the word, that means the more times that somebody has said it. So we've got things like challenge, support, inclusive in there. We've got scaffolding. We've got oh no, fear. We've got assessment is for learning. We've got ability groupings. We've got medium, spicy, and super spicy. We've got a level of challenge, child specific. Participation, adapting tasks, appropriate levels, learning at your level, accessible, individualised, technology. So lots of good examples coming in there. Um, and hopefully as you go through tonight, you'll begin to see lots of those words being talked about. Before we begin the session, we thought it was really important just to kind of stop and reflect on some of the kind of common myths that exist when people talk about differentiating. And these are some of the things that, with Jack and Maria and I, in our own teaching careers, we kind of were tying ourselves in knots with some of these things. So we thought, let's make sure that we're all kind of starting from the same page in terms of differentiation. So first of all, is that myth that everything in the lesson needs to be differentiated for every group, for everything that they were doing. And this is one that I was certainly bad for falling into the trap to. So if I was teaching a numeracy and math lesson, I would be trying to find 3 different written tasks, 3 different games, 3 different things that the children would be doing independently, and then 3 different things that I would be teaching to the groups that I was working with. And that was one lesson. I then had a literacy lesson, and then I had 5 days of teaching to be filling up. And so, initially I was tying myself in knots, spinning lots of plates trying to do that. So hopefully as we go through tonight, one of our aims is to show you some of the ways that you can use the same tasks, but actually there are different ways that you can differentiate by things like your expectation and your outcome. Another common one that we hear people talking about is that there's only one way to differentiate. So this is the way to differentiate. And again, hopefully as we go through the session tonight, you'll see that there's lots of different things that people can do in terms of ways to differentiate for their learners at their age and stage. The next myth that we hope to kind of bust is about that it's always about filling gaps in the learning. And this is where we kind of sometimes hear that people talk about, well, they don't know this, so we'll just fill bits and pieces in. And actually, a lot of the time, to be effective in your differentiation, it's about considering where the children are, what they can do, as well as what they can't do. So it's not just about kind of teaching to everybody and then, oh, this little group that haven't got it, just keep doing the same things over and over and over again, filling in the gaps that they've got. It's about considering where different children are and how best to move their learning forward. Another one that we commonly hear is that people just kind of plan to the middle. So they plan one lesson and then they think about, well, I'll make it a little bit easier and a little bit harder and that'll be fine for everybody else. So again, we want to make sure that you understand why you need to differentiate, the best ways to do that. If you are needing to make things easier, why is that? What are the skills that those children have not grasped yet? Why have they got gaps? You don't just want them to be going over the same things over and over again. You actually want to be considering the gaps. And in terms of challenging, making sure that there is that appropriate level of challenge in place. Another one that you often hear, and this is one that we often pick up in some of the Facebook groups and things like that, is when people ask for tips on differentiation, the kind of most common thing that comes through is carousels. And, they almost are put across as one of the only ways to differentiate. Carousels can work very effectively in terms of having different children working on different things, but and in case you're not aware of that term, that's where you might have 3 groups within your class working on 3 different activities and they carousel around it. So, they're playing an interactive game, they're working with the teacher, they're doing something else, a written task or something like that. And the children rotate round the different stations. This can work really well as an effective way to differentiate, but it does rely on very careful planning to make sure that when children are accessing things independently, they know what to do. That can sometimes involve kind of training children around accessing things independently, what happens if they finish, what happens if they get stuck, and also ensuring that you're building time in to go back over the stations in the carousel that you haven't necessarily been part of, because you can't have somebody filling in a written task, getting it all wrong, and then it's never looked at again, or it's not looked at until the next time you do that area of maths. So again, carousels, yep, they can work really effectively, but we need to make sure that we're thinking carefully about what we're doing and why. And then the next one, and I was glad to see that this came up in somebody's answer, that the mild, hot and spicy are examples of effective differentiation. Again, one that we quite often hear mentioned. So we hope when you go away tonight, you're thinking there isn't just that one golden way of differentiating, but it's about considering lots of different methods and selecting which combination is the most appropriate for your learners at that particular time in their learning and for that particular lesson. So a little bit more on the chili challenges, which is definitely a hot topic in education. You might have seen these referenced, so the kind of hot, spicy, mild or chili challenges. This is something that originates from the work of Shirley Clarke. And Shirley Clarke had a group of practitioners that she was working with as part of an action research group, and they were all trialling different things. One of the practitioners who was working with that decided that he was going to give his class a choice of tasks to do, and he named them mild, spicy and hot. And essentially it was an easy task, a medium task and a hard task, but named as mild, spicy and hot. Over the course of his research, the practitioner found that actually there was quite a lot of pitfalls with that particular approach. So things like children always choosing the hot task because they wanted to be seen as picking the hard one. Or some children who were maybe a bit unsure about challenging themselves always going for that mild task or the easier one because they wanted to kind of not get things wrong, or because they were keen to kind of be finished first and, oh, I'm the best at maths because I've finished the quickest. So when we look at Shirley Clarke's research now, it focuses on if you are using self-selected pupil tasks, you need to make sure that the names are unidentifiable. So you might see people using things like the fantastic challenge, the incredible challenge and the wonderful challenge. So there's no idea in the title as to which is the easier and the harder one from it. We've also heard some teachers where they name them after, you know, the apple, banana and pear task, or they use superheroes, the Hulk and the Spider-Man task, that kind of thing. And it's important that the levels should always change. So your apple task isn't always your easy one, and your Hulk one isn't always the most challenging. It's important as well that the tasks look similar. So the children are really focused on looking at the skills that they are being expected to use and picking the one that's most appropriate. So for example, they might all be on addition. One is adding with 2 digits, one's adding with 3 digits. Again, this was a pitfall that I fell into once. Noticed that children who were quite good at self-selecting had all picked one task, couldn't understand why nobody else had picked the ones that were kind of more appropriate for them, and it was because it had colouring in and the learning assistant had just put the brand new shiny sharpened coloured pencils out, and so actually they all just wanted to colour in with the new pencils. So making sure that actually it's not about picking the task because that looks the most exciting. They all look very similar. Children are just trained to look at the skills. We also have seen some examples where it's just one sheet and there's different parts of it, so they can do the top of the sheet, the middle of the sheet, the bottom of the sheet. Again, it's not always the easiest bits at the top and the hardest bits at the bottom. And it's also important that it's modelled that children can change the task, so that if they are finished quickly, it's that discussion about, well, why don't you try this bit? or if they are sitting there and they're looking like that they're finding it very challenging and they've tried some scaffolds and they're still not being able to get it, it's that, right, we'll have another look. Is there another one that would be better suited for you? So that they're not just always picking one and sticking with one, that you can understand that there is that option to change. So hopefully that's kind of cleared a little bit of that up. You will notice on the likes of some teaching sites that they still use the terminology mild, spicy and hot. So it's just being aware of what the sort of current research around that says. In terms of Education Scotland support, this briefing paper was written in 2015. It summarised the research that was available on differentiated learning, and it considered how best to improve the learner outcomes in numeracy and maths. This briefing paper draws on lots of research from small and large scale studies, and the majority of it comes from America. And although it was written over 7 years ago, lots of the key messages are still really important for us to consider. So we thought it was important to include that link there. And just to go over some of the kind of main things that come out of it, lots of reasons why we want to differentiate and why it's important. So we know that our children come with a variety of different learning needs. Some will need to have particular materials for specific reasons. We also know that children come from various educational and academic backgrounds with different experiences. They've got different gaps in their learning. They've got different misconceptions that they've developed. We also know that our children have different attention spans and different interests. So some need things to be given in much smaller chunks. Some need particular hooks for them to be interested and wanting to learn more about it. We know that some of our learners also have different language abilities, and so they might need particular support with the likes of mathematical vocabulary. And we know that children enjoy, as we do as adults, we enjoy learning in different ways and about different things. And so involving children in how they learn and giving them that choice and that personalisation helps them to have more ownership of how they're learning. Now, we can't expect all children to be working at the same academic level in maths. So we need to think about, well, why would we plan our lessons in that way? The benefits that differentiation brings means that we are able to zone in more closely on the individual needs, and that then helps us to understand the children's abilities and needs better. And we know that when we get differentiation right, some of the things that come out of that is that actually we help with that confidence and self-belief with children because they're experiencing success at their level. And then that in turn can help to improve their resilience and their mindset and that feeling of actually I am really good at maths and I can do this because they are learning and being taught at the level that's appropriate for them. We know that it can help to more increased enjoyment and engagement. You know, there's nothing worse than sitting there and something is too hard for you, or you don't understand something, or, you know, something is far too easy for you. So we know that if we get it right, we do increase that enjoyment. And over time, these things can then lead to raised attainment because we're getting it right for every child at that level. Now, before we begin to think about some of the ways to differentiate our maths lessons, I'm going to hand you over to Maria, who is going to share some of the things that you can do to ensure that your classroom ethos is built around promoting that positive maths mindset.
Thank you, Yvonne. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So Yvonne provided for us there a very effective overview of what differentiation is and perhaps what it's not. And what I'm going to do is just take you through a few slides looking at some considerations that you might need to consider before we talk about those practical aspects in terms of numeracy and maths. So for differentiation to be effective, and we know this out with numeracy and maths across the piece, setting that right ethos is really important. And that's about making sure we have that culture in place where everyone feels respected. We need the learners that we support to feel safe, and we need them to feel confident enough to make mistakes and use these mistakes as a learning opportunity. We also need to promote for our learners ways that they can become unstuck. So if they find themselves in a challenging situation, we need to make sure that they're equipped with ways and strategies to become unstuck, and not for the go-to just to be directly to put their hand up and ask the teacher, which we know in our context is sometimes their go-to. Yvonne mentioned earlier on the work of Carol Dweck, and when we talk about growth mindset, a lot of the early thinking in terms of growth mindset came from work that Carol Dweck carried out. And she identified that everyone really holds ideas, and this is children and adults, hold ideas about what their own potential is, with some people thinking that what they know and their intelligence is really quite fixed. That you can either do math or you can't. And when we think about our learners, we'll know and be able to quickly identify some of our learners who do show signs of having that fixed mindset, and that they might give up quite easily, compared to the learners who have maybe got more of a growth mindset, those who, despite the challenges, despite when they get stuck, despite when it's maybe a bit harder, they'll keep going, they'll be persistent. The website that you can see there on the top of the screen, just over to the right-hand side, will tell you a wee bit more about the work of Carol Dweck if it's something that you're not familiar with. But for us, it's, in terms of what we can do, it's about creating that maths positive culture. And again, it's not just with our learners, it's with our peers, it's with our parents, it's about any other adults that we work with across our establishments and beyond, and to challenge sometimes those comments that we hear in terms of that negativity that's sometimes associated, in particular in a numeracy and maths context, and to build up that culture that I spoke about earlier on in terms of our learners feeling safe to make mistakes, but not in a negative way, that they can use these as ways that they can learn and grow and develop. What might be a good way, just a practical takeaway, is that you check in with your learners, ask them how they're feeling. Now, we do this in lots of ways in terms of formative assessment, but it's more closely linked to what we're teaching and learning in general. But what about thinking about that in terms of how they're feeling? Again, you can use some of the formative assessment strategies that you currently use, so exit passes or traffic lights and all the types of things that we would use in terms of formative assessment, even more detailed learning conversations that you might want to have with those learners for whom you know their mindset is just a bit more fixed. But doing those routine check-ins with your learners, but maybe with that focus on their feelings and their attitudes, rather than just using them in terms of their achievements and their attainment. And we know that maths anxiety is common, and it's common, it's a national, but probably wider than national, but we know that it's common, and we know that it can limit performance. But we know, and the point that we need to make quite clear to people is that it's not linked to intelligence or ability. However, if you suffer from maths anxiety, it often feels like it is linked. But what we need to do is just try and reinforce that idea that people can be maths successful, and that with a bit of effort and with a bit of resilience that we can actually move the learning on. And we'll talk a wee bit more about this in the next sort of couple of slides that I share. But what you'll see coming onto the slide just now is just some of the potential causes of maths anxiety, and you in your context will have come across a lot more. So again, use the chat function maybe if there's something that we've missed here. I don't like pressurised situations, and I think the children I supported, but my own children too, found sometimes those pressurised situations to be quite anxious. So that could be high stakes or sometimes even low stakes testing, being under timed conditions, and this is what I meant when I said I don't potentially like those pressurised situations. I can do something really well, but put a timer in front of me and I tend to lose all sense of rationale. So again, think about that in terms of some of the activities that we might present to our children. It could also be about the learners feeling judged by you or the other adults, or indeed by their peers, and about that idea of having to produce that answer quickly. So it's about that speed of recall. And we would say, oh, you know, it's about that process, and it's not necessarily about getting the right answer right away, but our learners sometimes feel that that's the expectation. It's also important to note that these things actually can sometimes motivate our learners in terms of that pressurised situation and the timed aspect of it, but we need to know our learners really well and know what works for them. Sometimes it can cause anxiety, and we need to be aware of this, which is why checking in with them, as I said in the last slide, is a good way just to keep on top of that. And again, thinking about why this might be the case, it could be that they've just had a negative experience in the past. They've maybe had an occasion where they felt quite embarrassed when they've got an answer wrong, and that might have been met with some negativity, and that can stick with them. We know that that can stick with them for a long time. Additionally, it could be that they're aware that the group they're in, if they're in set groups, kind of dents their self-esteem a little bit. It might mean that their self-esteem's taken a wee bit of a knock because they know they're always given the easy questions. They know they're always in the bottom group, regardless of how we dress that up. The learners kind of know that from an early age, and sometimes if they're in that group in primary 1 or 2, they tend to still be in that same group in primary 6 or 7, because so they learn. The learners are quite apt at picking this up. Some learners may also be affected by cultural bias, whether that's conscious or subconsciously. And again, we might think here in terms of gender or culture, and sometimes the way the media portrays things as well. We need to be aware of that too. So what can we do about it? Because we've identified that there are issues there. Some of the things that we can do about it is exactly what I said in the last slide. Ask our learners how they're feeling about different things. Look for signs of stress, look for signs of anxiety when you mention maths or numeracy, or when they are going from, maybe transitioning from a literacy lesson or an art lesson, and then we're talking about numeracy and maths. Just look out for some of those clues. Reduced cognitive load is a big one. And again, Yvonne mentioned that in terms of trying not to overwhelm our learners. Maybe chunking up the learning is quite a good way to do that. Maybe give them one step at a time so that they're concentrating on one thing at a time, achieving success before they move on. Because sometimes if it's presented in a big list of things, almost right away our learners are turned off by that. Obviously, it wouldn't be a presentation from us in the team if we didn't mention the use of concrete materials. So again, the use of concrete materials can be a really good way in order to help the learners overcome some of those anxieties. We might need to provide additional scaffolding or support where it's needed. But we need to just try and make sure that what we present to the learners is fun and that they can see the relevance and that it's presented in a fun way. We need to bring a wee bit and inject a wee bit of the joy back into numeracy and maths again. And again, I'm not saying that we do this every single lesson for every child all of the time, but doing that on a regular basis can really start to chip away at some of those maths anxiety and enhance that positivity that we are trying so desperately to achieve in terms of numeracy and maths. On the next slide, we'll look at some different approaches, and again, Yvonne mentioned this in her introduction, that we might want to consider in terms of differentiation. We'll mention Carol Ann Tomlinson a few times, and we'll provide a link at the very end to some further research that you might want to explore that Carol Ann Tomlinson has put together. But what you're seeing on the screen now has come from the work that Carol Ann put together. And we're just going to talk about them just very, very quickly. So thinking about differentiation and the content, what does that really mean? Well, this might be where you provide a task for learners, but it might contain different activities with varying different levels of challenge. Could be a worksheet with different levels on it, perhaps. It might be that you provide some learners with less instruction or more instruction, just thinking again back to that cognitive load. When we think about process, that might be just as simple as allocating more or less time. So giving some learners a bit longer or a bit shorter to complete a given task. It might be about giving learners a choice in how they approach the task. And again, in numeracy and maths, this might be the choice of what concrete materials or what visual representations they choose to demonstrate their understanding. We might think about digital technology here to support them to find solutions when they're looking at calculations. It can also involve choice in relation to what types of calculations they choose to do. So there's a whole wealth of stuff, and then we could probably do a session just unpicking the 4 elements on the slide just now. Product, if we move on to that one, is quite similar. It's about providing our learners with a choice in how they express their ideas. Again, it could be linked to what I said before in terms of the concrete materials that they might choose or the other resources and ways, pictorial representations that they choose to demonstrate and show their thinking. It might also be about whether ideas are expressed in written form or whether they want to express that orally. It might be digitally. Again, you can think of all the different ways that you use in your classrooms that might actually enhance that. The learning environment we're going to go on to talk about in a minute or two. So again, all of these It's just really about doing what's right for your learners and knowing what works for your learners, but the environment we'll come back to just in a slide or two. The next slide talks about, in order to try and meet all learners' needs in terms of that math anxiety, but also the learning and teaching assessment associated with maths, we need to think about the math supports and the prompts that we provide for our children. And it's really about looking at it from maybe an audit point of view and thinking about where are the maths supports and prompts that we provide, and can the children find them, first of all? Are they easily accessible? And if they are easily accessible, can the children easily transport them from one part of the room to the other? Because it shouldn't be that they're in a place that's suitable for the teachers or the practitioners or the adults in the room. The learners need to use them, and they need to know how to use them. And it's about that fourth bullet point. There's an important one. So if they don't know how to use them and why they might be beneficial, that's the opportunity for us as adults to model how these can really lead to that understanding. And that takes time, depending on the children that you're working with. But yes, make sure the supports that you're making available for your learners are clearly labelled so they know what they are and where to find them, and that they can transport them about the room, and not that they're just sitting there for particular lessons or particular concepts, or indeed for particular learners, but you refer to them and use them often, and model that for your learners so they can really see the benefits of them. On the next slide, we're talking here, you'll maybe be familiar with this. This particular image comes from Tess. Again, the link's there on the slide for you. This is the child-friendly version of it, and it was created by a gentleman called Tom Seninger. He renamed the zones, so just in order for it to be more sort of child-friendly, he renamed the zones as the comfort zone, the learning zone, and the panic zone. And you can probably tell where I'm going with this. The comfort zone is where the learner feels stable. That's where they feel sort of unchallenged. That's the work that they can do quite easily. What I would ask myself if that's the case is, are they really thinking? So the next zone, which is the learning or the stretch zone, is just pushing your learners just outside of that comfort zone. Within this space, it offers the children a bit of challenge. It asks them to take risks in their learning. It's kind of what we're aiming for, if we're being honest. But being careful that we're not pushing learners too far, because if we do, they're heading towards that panic zone. And that panic zone is where we'll see that maths anxiety in action. That's where our learners will become quite fearful, they'll become quite stressed, they'll be declined to learn, and we'll start to see that demotivation. And that can really exacerbate everything that I've said about maths anxiety. So essentially what I want you to take away from this slide is that all learners should be stretched and challenged. A wee caveat that goes alongside that, and again this was my interpretation of challenge, I have to be honest, is don't always associate challenge with our highly able learners, but think about challenge in terms of providing opportunities for all learners to be in that stretch zone, or that zone of proximal development. And how do we do that effectively? Well, we get to know our learners first and foremost, and we incorporate some forms of formative assessment. And again, we'll look a wee bit more in depth at that as we go through. On the next slide, I've spoken a lot there about in terms of knowing the learners, and absolutely that's the starting point. No matter how you organise your learning, your classroom, you need to know your learners really well. Your knowledge of individual children that you care for and you support is a key driver for success in differentiated learning. Knowing what they knowing what they know and can do is essential in planning how to take them further in their learning. But you also need to have a clear understanding of what you want them to learn and where their strengths and areas of need are. Knowing what interests them and engage them is also helpful in planning lessons, which will be really stimulating. And again, think how this fits into that maths anxiety. So across all of that, assessment is absolutely key. And it can't come from just one singular assessment. We would be looking to draw on a whole range of ongoing, periodic, formative assessment, in addition to all those daily observations that we do all the time in the classroom, that will help us identify next steps that will really challenge each learner appropriately. Reassessment is also important. Don't assume, and I did this, but don't assume that the learners don't know what you've not taught them. We know that our learners bring with them a whole wealth of knowledge and understanding. And the other side of that is don't assume that they do know what you have taught them. So those pre-assessments, and again, these can be done quite formally, but they can also be done quite informally, can really help you plan which direction you take the learning in. It doesn't need to be too time consuming. It can be something quite quick, and a lot of those formative assessment techniques can be quite useful for that, but will really help you direct where you're going next in terms of your learning and teaching. And when Jacqueline comes in after the break, she's going to unpick what that might look like in terms of practical ideas. So in the next slide, I spoke earlier on about that idea of the environment and that I would come back to that. And I'm going to talk a wee bit around that on this slide. But we know all too often that when learners experience that productive struggle or they feel stretched, their go-to is they'll either put their hand up and ask you, or they'll give up completely, or they'll start thinking and looking for other ways to keep them entertained. And sometimes behaviour can then become an issue. And again, this will resonate with you in terms of your own experiences. But there are lots of ways to promote more pupil independence and for learners to use and adapt supports and prompts to help them become unstuck. And you'll see some of these on the slide just now. And again, if you're using anything that's really worked for your learners, pop them into the chat. We know that these strategies support learners to take ownership of their own learning, their own interactions and problems, but it teaches them how to collaborate and use each other for support, to use each other for information and instruction. And what we want is we want for learners to try and to try again. We want our learners to not give up, certainly not at the first hurdle. We need to promote that knowing and understanding can take time and it can take effort, and that deep understanding that we are striving for often comes from trying different approaches. We sometimes need to stop and think. We need to use resources. We need to use our peers too. And sometimes, and what works for me when I'm maybe right in the thick of things and I can't get myself out of that zone, is I sometimes need to walk away from the issue, to provide a wee bit of distance, a wee bit of thinking time for myself, free up some of that cognitive load that I spoke about, and sometimes that just gives me a bit of space in order to revisit the problem or whatever it is with a bit more clarity, because we all get stuck. It's a normal part of our life, it's a normal part of learning, it's a normal part of how we get through life. We problem solve and we get stuck all the time. It's what we do about it. It's how we react and what strategies we have to help become unstuck. So we're developing problem-solving skills alongside this. We're hoping to promote creativity and innovative thinkers and build that resilience that we know is so important for learners to keep going and get themselves out of that kind of stuck zone. And when we think about everything that's on the slide just now, the classroom environment can be a really valuable learning tool, a real effective way of engaging and supporting children. Again, then it needs careful thought and it needs careful planning, but an effective classroom environment could be used as an interactive support to engage children in discussion and promote that independent learning through the use of accessible tools and scaffolding. A couple of things to note. Engage, if you are thinking about working walls and that classroom wider environment, engage with it regularly. Model how the thinking process works. So don't just have it as something that's in the room that just looks nice, and this was what I was guilty of. Make sure it's used as an extension of your teaching and learning. You might want to include things like key facts or associated language, but again, the learners can build on this. They might want to reword something and put it in terms that make sense to them. So it should be something that's very interactive, and the learners should be supported in how to do this. Our working walls should be constructed with our learners and built on together. And that's as the new learning or the new understanding develops. So it should be something they're back and forth with all the time. We might want to include examples of effective work or worked examples and include that on our working walls. And again, learners might want to add to that. We might want to include some misconceptions and mistakes, again, so that we can encourage that learning from our mistakes, and they should also feature on our working walls. And those modelled examples from previous learning can be used as a point of reference. Again, that can really support our learners' working memory, so they don't need to hold everything in their head. they can maybe have a go-to place where it just gets them over that. I've done this and this is what it meant. Now I can free up some cognitive load in order to concentrate on today's learning. So we know that working walls can lead to that improved engagement levels. We hope they lead to more independent learners and learners feeling they've more ownership of their learning and success. But ultimately, we want this learning environment and those working walls to help our learners have a better understanding of expectations. And again, thinking about adding key vocabulary, worked examples, you could include other things like post-it notes or whiteboards, 100 squares, 10 frames, just any learning resources that you have that will support the learners in developing and demonstrating their understanding. And maybe include a wee space or a place for questions and comments, because again, learners might not want to feed that back in terms of a plenary session, but they might be okay adding a wee comment that they think you'll pick up on later on. So again, it's just ways to chip away at that maths anxiety. Anything at all that we can use that will help support learners and ultimately lead to that deeper thinking and achievement is really helpful. So anything that reinforces that learning can really help build that confidence, build that independence, but chip away at that maths anxiety. So I've said quite a lot and I know Yvonne's given that overview. We're going to break. I think, Jacqueline, keep me right, is 5 minutes still okay? And I'll pass on to Jacqueline, who'll talk about specific approaches, and we'll really take all the learning that Yvonne and I have pulled together, but what does that look like in terms of differentiation in a numeracy and maths context? We're going to leave up the quote. I've mentioned Carol Ann Tomlinson a few times, but this quote comes from her, and the word respectful is really important here. Again, I mentioned it earlier on, but most of our children know when they've been given an easier task than the rest of the children in the class. And we know that that can lead to that self-esteem and, that idea of maths being looked at in a negative way. We're trying to avoid that as much as possible. So have a read over that quote just in the next sort of 5 minutes, and Jacqueline will then help pull this together with giving you some practical tips on how this could be done quite effectively. So Jacqueline, is it 5 minutes? Is that
Yeah, what we'll
on
do
task?
is that's just about 1:45, so we'll come back at 10 to, and when you come back, can you make sure that you've got a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper, because the next bit's a bit more interactive. I get the fun bit. So thank you, everyone, and Maria up till now. So we'll come back at 10 to. Thank you. Approaches that you can use to differentiate without causing that massive addition to your workload that I think sometimes differentiation can feel like it's going to be. A lot of the approaches that we're going to look at, you will have already seen at some of our previous sessions that we've delivered, but also you might have been using some of them before, so hopefully in some ways this will reassure that things that you're doing are on the right track. What we intend to do today is specifically demonstrate how these approaches can be useful when differentiating in your numeracy and maths lessons. So the first thing I want to look at is the low floor, high ceiling. So these are tasks which have multiple access points, and that really means that all learners can access them in a way which is suitable to their own particular learning and where they are. Why these are useful for differentiation, because they cut down on the amount of different tasks that you've got to plan, much like Yvonne talked about earlier, spinning 95 plates when you've got 4 groups, 3 different tasks for each group and multiple levels in each of them as well, which I was also guilty of doing, but actually you just end up tying yourself in knots. These type of tasks can cut down on the amount of things that you need to plan and prepare and get ready for your pupils, but they also allow all learners to feel included, which we've talked quite a lot about so far in the presentation, because all learners are presented with some sort of the same initial prompt, really. And the threshold, or you could look at it as the bottom access point of the task, it needs to be mathematically accessible for all the learners in the group, which means that everyone needs to have the prior mathematical knowledge required to start working on that problem. And that's why you have to set quite a low threshold. And this, of course, it will vary. It depends on the age, it depends on prior attainment, but really a task that has a low threshold for a P7 task is probably likely to be quite far out the reach of most P2 pupils. So you need to judge it based on where you know your learners are. These type of tasks are designed to have lots of built-in extension opportunities, and that's so that more challenging problems to solve can also be built in, and that's where the high ceiling comes in. So there's multiple access points here. What we want to kind of get across about the low access point is that it can really help fight that maths anxiety that we've talked about earlier on as well. by just making sure that learners don't fail straight away. They also feel that they're included with things as well, and everybody feels a sense of importance. The high ceiling provides an opportunity to develop resilience. Maria talked about problem solving, developing those problem solving skills. These types of tasks can help to do that as well. But it's just giving learners that sense of agency, because there's more than one pathway to these, so they can make decisions about where they're going to take their learning as well. So this is easier than having that classroom situation where different children are given lots of different activities to work on. So hopefully that helps to reduce some of your workload with the whole class working together on the same task, but in different ways, but it's a bit more subtle than that. Here's the easy task, here's the middle task, here's the difficult task. And I think also something that's important to note is that what's good about these is there's no predetermination as to who will work on the more challenging parts or the extension work, or who will go in at the lower level. And I think often as practitioners we can be quite guilty of putting learners into boxes and pigeonholing them. Oh, well, they're always getting the easy tasks or they're getting the harder tasks. But actually sometimes when we remove those barriers, there are learners that we have in front of us that can actually surprise us in really positive ways as well. So it's good to give them that opportunity. I'm going to skip the next slide because I feel that we've been quite theory heavy. I'll leave it in when I send it out so that you can have a look about it, but we've covered quite a lot of this already, so we can go on to the tasks as well today. So we have talked about open-rooted questions before, and these are questions which have one answer but different routes of getting there, and these are a good way to encourage children to learn at different levels, but they can also answer the question using the strategy that they understand the best and showcase their learning. Andrew Jeffrey summarises the most effective steps to take to encourage mathematical talk like this, and that is display the problem or the calculation or the dot pattern or the question, whatever it is. And at this stage, children would be using their mental calculations to solve this, and they're not required to write anything down. But rather than having children put their hand up when they're ready, and we know that this can be quite distracting for those still calculating. I don't know if you remember, I remember being in class and people put their hands up and you're like, panic. And a bit like Maria said earlier, my brain freezes and I go, I can't do it. I feel like I just need time and space to come up with it. And this way gives them, the learners, that freedom and that safe space to do that as well. But what they can do is, instead of putting their hands up, is they can use some of the hand signals that are just shown on the bottom right hand corner of this slide. And this indicates that they've either got an answer or they're still thinking, or that they've got multiple strategies as well. So the emphasis on using this approach is not on speed, because again, there's that misconception that fast means better at maths, but actually no, that's not that, and we've talked about that before. But actually what is encouraged here is the different solutions and taking time to think about what they could be. We really want to be encouraging children to think of different ways to solve the calculation, because the more strategies that they can use, the deeper their understanding will be as well. So once they've had taken time to think about what strategies they're going to use, you would then invite the children to share their solutions. And you won't ask everybody, obviously. You'll pinpoint learners depending on your own situation. And the teacher would then record these either as written steps or as a visual representation, and that could be in the form of a bar model or an area model or something like that. It's then important to take time to discuss the different strategies and possibly some of the different answers that have come out as well. And some children might then choose to actually change their answer or strategy based on what they've heard from others, and that's okay, because that's part of the learning process. It's also really important to talk about the efficiency of the strategies. So, for example, if we take the 58 add 78, one child might have said, I've added 10 7 times and then I added 1 8 times, which is correct, but is it really the most efficient strategy, the most efficient way of calculating it? And I think for children to develop that strong number sense, they need to have access to multiple strategies, but then be encouraged to come to the decision about what is the most efficient one to use. And you can do that through discussion and dialogue. Another thing you can do as well is you can use children's strategies as a way of modelling different approaches. So for example, you might have taken a solution from Joe, and then you say to the learners, well, for the next question, let's try and use Joe's method of rounding up to the nearest 10 first and see how we got on. And you can then take strategies and move that learning on as well. Okay, so here we have examples of different types of open-ended questions, and these are questions which have multiple different answers to them as well. And this isn't about, the focus isn't here about the strategy that's used to calculate it, but it's more about the reasoning and the justification behind the children's answer. So the ones that we've got on the slide here are which one doesn't belong, what can you tell me about, how many different ways can we do or make something, and would you rather. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can explore that in your own time, but I'm just going to focus in one of the examples. What we do like about these types of questions are that they're good ways of encouraging mathematical talk, which we've talked about previously as being so important, but they also allow for differentiation because they help learners think about different possible reasons at a level that's suited to their own mathematical understanding. So, for example, if we look at the one about what can you tell me about the number 63? Some learners might say it's an odd number, or some might say it's the number after 62. Others might say that it's closer to 60 than 70, or that it's in the 60th decade, or that it's made up of 6 tens and 3 ones. But others might take this just a wee bit further and say 63 is not a prime number, or list the factors of 63. They might say, for example, 1, 3, 7, so on, are all factors of 63. So in the examples that I've just given you there, everyone has an answer that is correct, but they have accessed the question using their relevant mathematical skills. And that will tell you a lot about where they are in their learning and what their next steps need to be as well. These types of approaches are really good because they can give that confidence boost to children who think they're not as good at maths, but that they're able to answer the same questions as others around them can help them. And using these types of questions provides opportunities for children to listen to each other and the justification that their peers give, which can help to deepen their own learning and their understanding as well. Okay, time to do a little bit of work. Easy work, not too bad. We've mentioned what do you notice before. I know we mentioned it in the problem solving session 2, but let's try it with a different example today, just to kind of show you an example of how to home in and how differentiation can be used as well. So you have a graph here, and what I want you to do is, with the pen and paper that I asked you to get at the break, take a couple of minutes, well, maybe 1, maybe 2, we'll see how time goes, to write down everything that you notice about this graph on your piece of paper. So everything that you notice, and I'm going to pause and just let you do that just now. I'll give you another moment or two, but if anybody wants to start posting some possible, some potential things that they've noticed in the chat, that would be great as well. And be brave. Always takes one to start and everybody then follows. Okay, thanks Heather. It's clear and it's easy to read. Vertical scale starts at 0, thank you. It's in order, it's colour coded. It increases in intervals of 2, great. From smallest to largest, 2's colour coded. Okay, now obviously if you were doing this with your learners, you'd give them a lot more time than this, but I'm conscious that it's at the end of a busy day, so I'm just going to move on a wee bit now. Looking at this graph, at the lower end of this task, if you think of it as a low floor, high ceiling task, at the lower end, learners might come up with some simple observations about the graph, such as the ones that you see on the left-hand side here, and some of them were included in the chat as well. And that's fine because that is correct, and it will tell you a lot about where the learners are at with their learning as well. Other learners might begin to read the scale and find out the numerical value for one of the animals or for each of them as well. And then some learners might begin to use calculations based on what they can see. So for example, how many motor teeth does one animal have than the other? Or what is the total number of teeth represented in the whole graph? Some learners might also begin to make inferences from it, similar to the example in the bottom right-hand corner. So you can see here, mice have the least teeth because they're the smallest. That's drawing conclusions from it as well. The point of doing this with you today is that really we wanted to kind of point out that just this one graph and that one simple question can actually provide so many different access points for learners, and that's absolutely fine. But it will also help you see exactly where learners are in their learning. So if you can see that some learners are making simple observations, they begin to hear what their peers are saying, and they begin to learn from that as well. What I would say is, in this kind of approach, sometimes the learners find it a wee bit tricky at the beginning, so you might have to model things that they could notice, and this will increase their skill level as they go along. Excuse me, I'm trying to move the slides and talk at the same time, and it slows me down. So this brings us on to the importance of being responsive to how our learners approach different tasks and act on it, and help us act on it as soon as possible. What we need to be aware of is what our learners are doing and saying, and we can do this by building in time to observe and by using a range of different formative assessment strategies that I no doubt you're already familiar with, and we mentioned some earlier on. This helps us to spot any misconceptions that are arising, and then act on them. Now, we know that responding in the moment is the most effective approach, and when we can do that, that's great. But we also know that it's not always possible. So by observing and by using those formative assessment strategies, it can help us to plan and adapt future lesson inputs, and this can help us to then provide further input for those who require it, or actually provide further challenge for those who weren't challenged enough as well. So if we go back to the graph example, the previous page about the animal teeth, the teacher can notice what types of observations the learners are making. So it might be that they're listening to conversations, or they're observing their ideas through formative assessment. And if a learner is providing really simple observations, then you as a teacher can then prompt them a wee bit further by asking more specific questions, such as, what do you notice about the number of teeth the orca has? Or additionally, maybe the learners are just actually making factual statements at the moment and not beginning to make any inferences. What you could then do is plan time in the next session to focus on how to make inferences and draw conclusions from these graphs as well. And of course, these are just some examples of how you can use this differentiated approach to move learning forward. There are, of course, more, and it really does depend on each set of learners, so you need to take that into consideration as well. But this is just to kind of give you a wee bit of food for thought with it just now. We've used the which one doesn't belong approach with you before, but we just want to look at it again from a kind of differentiated approach sort of angle. So in the which one doesn't belong, learners are provided with 4 different images or items, doesn't need to be numbers, and they have to decide which of the items doesn't belong and why they think it doesn't belong. And what we like about this approach is that it can promote that deeper mathematical thinking and discussion, and it works well as it shows learners that there doesn't always have to be one correct answer, and there can be many justifications for different things in maths as well, because we do know that there's a common misconception that in maths there's one correct answer, and we're kind of trying to challenge that all the time. In some cases there is, but not in lots of cases there isn't as well. So let's just try it with this first example. Look at this set of numbers and decide which one of them doesn't belong. And think about your reason for this, and then note it in the chat. I'll give you a few moments to look at that, think about that. So which one doesn't belong and why? Okay, so we've got 27, all the others have 3 in them. 27 doesn't have 3 in it. 31 doesn't divide by 3. 27, yep, similar. 123 is a 3-digit number. Okay, so quite a few answers in the chat there, and thank you to those of you that have contributed. We do appreciate you engaging with us at the end of a long day. But you can see that some of the sort of simple suggestions could be that it's 3 because it's only single digit number, or 27 as it's the only number without the digit 3. But others actually might begin to make more complex reasons, such as 31 is the only one you can't divide by 3. You could see that in the chat there as well. But it is also important, as we've mentioned before, to observe these responses and rationales and really notice them, because it will help to provide you with that good insight as to where the learners are and how you can push them forward. I'm just going to show you some other examples. We're not going to go through them, but just to show you how different this can look. It doesn't need to just always be numbers as well. There is a website just at the bottom of the screen there, the which one doesn't belong, where there are loads and loads of examples. So, you know, you don't feel you need to go and make these up. You can, of course, if you want, but there's loads there for all different levels, so you can use them. And quite often people use them as a wee starter task as children are arriving or at the beginning of a lesson, just to kind of get thinking going for the day. So again, we've looked at open questions before, but we want to just focus today on how these can support differentiation. So open-ended questions are framed in such a way that a variety of responses or approaches can be possible. We like them because they can encourage creativity and higher order thinking, because learners can use different approaches and materials to find solutions and also demonstrate and represent their thinking. This type of approach is really good for differentiation because, again, it allows for those multiple entry points. So think about that low floor, high ceiling that we talked about earlier on. And learners don't feel that they're just always getting the easy questions or the hard questions. It is just that more equitable approach again. It's also a good type. The open-ended questions also help to lend themselves to generalisation as learners progress through the levels. So, for example, they might begin to notice patterns, or they might be able to think about how rules could be created as they start to think algebraically. That'll be a wee bit further on in their learning, but it can help to develop that line of thinking as well when they're exploring things. So what I want you to do now, I'm really making work. You'll be like, oh, bring back Marie and Yvonne. They let me just sit and listen. I want you on your piece of paper is to pick one of these questions and then see how many solutions you can find for just one of these questions and write them down in your paper. And I'll be quiet again while you do that. So just pick one and as many different solutions or observations that you can make about that. Thanks, Mrs. Susan. You've picked the measure one and you've given some possible answers there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just look at the one at the top right hand corner there about rounding to 30. You might have picked another one, and thank you if you have, but we obviously don't want to go through them all tonight, so I'm just going to pick out the one about rounding to 30. So some learners will put some whole numbers down, so it might be that they put 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, or 31 up to 34. And if they don't and they put something else, then actually you're able to learn from that and spot the misconception, and then you're able to address it. For example, if someone puts 35, you'll know that they've not understood that if the one's columns and 5, we should be rounding up. Some learners might also begin to use decimal fractions using this same question. So it might be either to one decimal place, for example, 29.6 or 30.4. But some might take it even further and begin to use two decimal places. So that could be 29.76 or 30.24. So you can see how just that one very simple question at the top right could be used at different levels as well, because we know the reality is that in your classroom, particularly if you're a primary 7 or 6 teacher, you do have learners of very differing levels within your class often. So it can be hard to pitch it sometimes. So we're just kind of trying to point out how these open type questions can actually be used for different learners at different levels as well. All right, keep losing the mouse to click on. Looking at the here is the answer, what is the question approach. This is another approach that's useful for differentiating. So in this approach, learners are provided with an answer to an unknown question. It might be a mathematical representation, for example, a number or a calculation, could be an object, could be an image. And then they're asked to create a question or questions that would give this answer. So again, let's do it. I really am pushing you tonight. I promise we've only got a few more tasks. What I want you to do is pick one of these, whether it's 5 square, 1.25 metres or 75%, and post in the chat what the question could be. So if that's the answer, what could the question? Make sure you post the answer too so that we know which one it's linked to. Should be obvious, but you never know. You don't know how complex some of your solutions are. I think I've tired people out. Okay, thank you. What do you add to 25% to make 100%? 3/4 as a percentage. What's half of 10? I think we can work out which ones he's linked to. Convert 3/4 to a percentage. 20 divided by 4. And obviously in a classroom setting, you wouldn't be giving them all 4 of these at once. You'd be just giving them one, but it's just to kind of, what's the easiest time sale? Sorry. I would say a question that I would say for me it's a 10 or the 1. So yeah, it's just to show you how just this one prompt can actually can be accessed in lots of different ways. And we're just going to show you some of the potential solutions. These are not all of the questions that could be asked, but just to show you the variety of different questions that learners can come up with. And again, that's helping you identify where they are in their learning and helping you move on, but making, not making you have to create loads and loads of different tasks as well. So I'll not spend too much time on this. We'll just move on. You will get a copy of these slides so that you can look at them in more detail later on. But just another extra point is you can also extend this type of activity by adding in some additional conditions. So you could give them the prompt or the answer, but then ask them, well, can you think of another question that would give that same answer? Or could you think of a more challenging question that would give this answer? Or can you think of a worded problem that would give this answer? And so on. So the next one is the what else do you know approach, and it's very similar to the what else do you know, and it can be used in similar ways as well. But this, again, they're provided with a mathematical representation, so a number, a calculation, an object or an image, and then they're asked to note down everything that they know about it. Or initially it might be, could you write down one thing about it? But then you keep saying to them, well, what else do you know? Until they've got no more ideas. And that is just to keep extending learners' thinking, keep challenging them and assess how far they're able to take it as well. But one thing I would say is just be careful not to push them too far, because you need to try and judge when enough is enough, because you don't want to end up making the situation boring and maybe upsetting or stressful for them. So you know your learner, you know how far to push them. So again, very quickly, pick a box, write down 3 facts or calculations related to it. And I'm going to make this the last task because I've got a few more slides just to get through with important information for you. So we'll make this the last task. And thank you for engaging. So what else do you know? It's a 20 pence. You've gone for the 20 pence. Great. What else do you know then? Either put it in the chat or write it in your paper. I've got 7 slides, thank you. So if we were picking the 20 pence, we're getting is equal to 2 10 pence. So I like the fact that actually we're building in the 20 pence here in the chat, and thank you for doing other ones as well. 2 times 10 pence is the same value as 20. What's a fifth of a pound? Now 20 pence is an £8. Yep, so lots of different things there just based on that 20 pence. And again, with this sort of thing, when you start this with learners, at first they'll look at you as if you've got 2 heads. I don't know, it's too blank a canvas for me, that sort of thing. But actually, you might need to model it with them a wee bit to begin with, just to help get that thinking started. But the more you do this type of activity, the better they get at it. We don't have time to look at all the answers to all 4 in the previous slide, but here are just some potential responses for the 3/4 and the 20 pence. Again, they're not the only responses, but they're just a sample of what's likely to be the kind of more common ones. And for the 20 pence one, we've created 20 pence using coins here, but actually they might begin to extend that by using worded problems or including fractions. For example, it's a fifth of a pound and so on. With I've kind of talked about the modelling, so it is important to do that. And if you find that when you do something like this and the learners aren't really engaging it in the beginning, persevere, because they will get there with it. Even though it feels a wee bit difficult to begin with, it is worth it, and it is worth keep going with it as well. So the final strategy we're going to look at, and I'm not going to make you work on this one today, you'll be pleased to hear, is the goal-free approach. So we looked at that in session 2, but we just want to look at it through that differentiation lens today. So the research by Sweller et al. Suggests that solving traditional problems which have a specific goal or a specific solution can be quite cognitively demanding, particularly when the problem's in an unfamiliar context. And I don't think that'll surprise anyone to hear that. But this is because more often than not, the solution to these worded problems can only be found by completing all the different steps that lead up to it. And if you miss out one, the chances are you're not going to get to it as well. And that can cause cognitive overload, which will quite often, for some learners, end up a failure to solve the problem, which can be quite demotivating for them as well, and probably won't lead to any new learning. Sometimes even when the problem is solved, learners have just kind of robotically worked their way through it, and actually there's still not any new learning taking place. So this approach actually presents information, but without a specific goal. So that's why they're called goal-free. And what it means is that the information can be explored again at that level, which is appropriate to each individual learner. And the solutions to lots of different things can be found through this as well. So what we like about this is that learners can feel more in charge of what they're doing, and it feels less like they're working their way through robotically through lots of preset questions. And on the screen here, these are just some examples of what they might look like at different levels. And you can see from what we've been doing up to this stage today as well, that there's lots of different solutions that learners might come up with, and they can be explored and shared together as well. There's some links in there as well that link into further resources for you. Just if we take the Chemmy and the clubs question, some of the potential questions that learners could create are in the blue bubbles on the side here. If we had a wee bit more time, I'd get you to create them yourself, but I think I've made you work hard enough today. And then also the peached bubbles here are some of the things that they might be able to work out from that information. But of course, you'll know that there are many more as well. We have also produced a mini guide on goal-free problems, which we've linked to if you're interested in more information. And the other links will take you to a page, a few pages from a person called Jean Knapp, who is in the English curriculum but has created lots of these, and they're freely accessible and really good to use with the learners as well. So this has been quite a heavy session. We do appreciate that, but we're just about finished. Just a couple more things to go through. What we need to think about now is what's next. You've been a part of this programme. Some people joined at the beginning, some people have joined through, and that's absolutely fine as well. We've been really grateful to have you in there. But I think it's important to think about what do you want to concentrate on next in your maths journey? And it might be that you don't want to concentrate in maths. You've got something else that you want to focus on, whether that's writing or reading or health and wellbeing or something else. But for some of you, you will want to carry on with your numeracy and maths journey as well. So what we're going to do is the thing link that you'll be familiar with here on the screen here. It's going to be kept live until the end of August. And we're going to launch a refreshed one in September. It will have most of the same content, but we're going to do a wee bit of upgrading and tweaking based on feedback that we've received, and we'll do that over the summer, just because we want to keep it fresh and we want to keep it relevant and useful to people as well. We're going to add in some of our material that we've got from our other sessions, which are dyscalculia, dyslexia, early counting strategies and skills, and also links to other general supports that we can provide as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to email you in August with the registration link to gain access to the refreshed version. It won't actually open until the 1st of August. You can see that it's on the screen here. So if you were to scan it or click on it just now, it would take you to the page, but it doesn't go live until the 1st of August. And you might feel that you don't want to be a part of this again. That's absolutely fine. If you do want to be a part of this again, you don't need to come to the live sessions if you've already attended them, but it might be that you just want to continue to access the modules on the thing link. That's absolutely fine as well. We're trying to make this as flexible as possible so that you can dip in and out of it when it suits you. But what we're going to do next year as well is we're going to actually add in a mini inquiry option, which is completely optional. And it might suit some of you who've been a part of this programme, where really what we want you to do is just try a small test of change with your learners, a really small inquiry, one small change, and kind of practice and measure the impact of that as well. But that's something that we'll provide more details when we send out the email in August about the whole programme. But it's just to let you know what's coming. So if you are starting to think about your professional development for next year, that might be able to be incorporated into it, but it might be that you don't want to, and that's absolutely fine as well. It's just so that you know what your options are available. But I will email you all out information about this either at the end of June, but most likely in the new session, so that you're nice and fresh and not and ready to go again. Now, we are at the end of the programme for this year, so it is really important to us to gather feedback on what's worked well and what we can improve. We have built in time into this session just now for you to complete this evaluation, which I'm just going to post in the chat. It does only take a few minutes. It really helps us shape things for next year because, as I said, we're going to be working on it over the summer. So your feedback helps us what's worked well, maybe what's not worked as well, how can we improve it. All of this feedback, positive and constructive, is really helpful to us as well. So you can either scan it using the code on the screen, or you can click on the link in the chat. I will also email out a copy of the slides and the evaluation tomorrow, but if you could complete this before you leave tonight, that would be great. I'll come back to this so that it's on the screen, but just a couple more things and then we're done. Just a reminder of our professional learning community, you do have to be logged on to Glow to access it, but it's our one-stop shop for all our resources. And what we do suggest is that if you've not done it already, save it to your favourites. It's got so many links to professional learning and materials that can help you with numeracy and maths. And we also have the news section. And if you keep an eye on that, we post links to new publications, professional learning, or any sort of webinars coming up that are of interest, or external things. So things like Maths Week Scotland, National Numeracy Day, lots of things can go up there as well. But just remember that you need to be logged into Glow. Our Twitter as well, if you like Twitter, maybe you love it, maybe you hate it, but you're welcome to follow us if you are on Twitter. And we post updates to all of these things as well that I've just mentioned. I'm not going to show you any further slides, but I just want you to know that there are slides further on here that when I send it out, that have links to just some further resources. We knew we wouldn't have time to cover it all today, but things that are kind of relevant to this as well, we've put in there so you can explore that in your own time. But I'm just going to go back to the evaluation just now, and if you could complete that, that would be absolutely great. Maria, Yvonne and I will hang on for 5-10 minutes so that if anybody's wanting to ask any questions or anything like that, we will be here to answer them. I'll make sure that I'm just going to try and change it so that you can put your hand up if you want to speak and that you'd be able to unmute. So let me just work out how to do that while I'm sharing my screen as well. Maybe everyone, you could do that because I've forgotten how to do it, if I'm honest.
Okay.
Thanks. Multitasking I used to be good at. I just don't know what's going on anymore. But yeah, a massive thank you to everybody for taking part in this, and watch this space if you want to continue. But yeah, we're still here if you want to have a conversation with us about anything or ask any questions. There's not that many, so you could just unmute your mic. Thank you.